Commander Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the prestigious Galactic Military Academy, watching alien cadets practice combat formations in the courtyard below. Her reflection in the reinforced glass showed a woman barely 30 years old, yet her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived through hell and emerged victorious. The crisp academy uniform felt strange against her skin after years of battle-worn armor and survival gear. 3 months had passed since the collective had honored her with admission to the most elite military institution in known space. 3 months since she had saved Earth from the Zarathi invasion that had left billions dead and entire continents in ruins. The humans called her a hero, the galaxy called her a legend, but Sarah felt like a ghost haunting hallways filled with beings who had never truly known war. The academy housed the finest military minds from across 17 different species. Tall, graceful Etherians with their translucent skin and telepathic abilities, massive Corvan warriors whose rock-like hides could deflect plasma rounds, swift Zephyrian scouts with their 4 arms and compound eyes. Each species brought centuries of military tradition and tactical knowledge accumulated over peaceful generations. Sarah was the only human. The morning alarm chimed through the dormitory complex, and Sarah made her way to the tactical simulation chamber. Her instructor, General Vextar of the Corvan, stood nearly 3 meters tall with skin that resembled polished granite. His species had been the backbone of collective military might for over 2,000 years, yet even he regarded Sarah with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Today we study the Battle of Kepler 442, General Vextar announced to the assembled class of 50 cadets. A textbook example of defensive positioning against overwhelming odds. Sarah recognized the battle immediately. It had been fought 200 years ago between collective forces and a rebel faction. The defenders had held their position for 6 months before reinforcements arrived. The casualties were minimal by galactic standards, perhaps a few thousand on each side. As the holographic display showed the battle formations, Sarah found herself analyzing everything differently than her classmates. Where they saw elegant tactical maneuvering, she saw missed opportunities. Where they admired the careful preservation of life, she saw hesitation that could have cost them the war. A Zephyrian cadet named Kithara raised one of her 4 arms. "General, the defensive commander's decision to retreat from the eastern ridge seems questionable. Wouldn't holding that position have been more tactically sound?" General Vextar nodded approvingly. "An excellent observation. However, holding that position would have resulted in an estimated 30% casualty rate among the eastern garrison. The collective values the preservation of sentient life above territorial gains." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the scar running along her left arm, a memento from the Battle of New Sydney, where she had held a similar position with 47 other human soldiers against 3,000 Zarathi warriors. They had held for 18 hours straight, and only 12 humans had survived, but they had bought enough time for the civilian evacuation that saved 2 million lives. "Commander Chen," General Vextar's voice cut through her memories. "What is your assessment of the defensive strategy?" Every eye in the chamber turned to her. Sarah could feel the weight of their expectations, their curiosity about the human who had somehow accomplished the impossible. She stood slowly, her mind racing through the tactical display. "The strategy was sound for a peacetime military," she said carefully. "The commander prioritized preservation of forces and minimized casualties while achieving the objective. It's textbook collective doctrine." "But," General Vextar prompted, sensing there was more. Sarah hesitated. How could she explain that sometimes victory required sacrifices that seemed unthinkable to these beings who had known relative peace for generations? How could she make them understand that when your world was dying and your species faced extinction, you learned to make choices that would haunt you forever? "But in a total war scenario, that level of caution could be catastrophic," she continued. "If the enemy isn't bound by the same rules of engagement, if they're willing to sacrifice everything for victory, then sometimes preservation of individual units has to be secondary to the larger strategic goal." The chamber fell silent. An Etherian cadet named Zelthara, her translucent features expressing confusion, spoke up. "Are you suggesting that deliberately sacrificing troops is acceptable military doctrine?" "I'm suggesting that war isn't always about what's acceptable," Sarah replied, her voice steady but heavy with experience. "Sometimes it's about what's necessary." General Vextar studied her for a long moment. "Can you provide an example of when such extreme measures might be justified?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and suddenly she was back on Earth, standing in the command bunker beneath the ruins of Geneva. As the Zarathi fleet blotted out the sun, she could smell the smoke and blood, hear the screams of the dying, feel the impossible weight of commanding humanity's last desperate stand. "When the alternative is extinction," she said quietly, "when you're not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage, but for the very survival of your species. When every hour you buy with blood gives your people one more chance to find a way to survive." The holographic display flickered as General Vextar changed the scenario. Instead of the Battle of Kepler 442, the chamber now showed the final battle for Earth. Sarah's throat tightened as she watched the tactical representation of humanity's darkest hour, simplified into neat symbols and trajectory lines that could never capture the reality of what had happened. "Perhaps," General Vextar said, his massive frame somehow conveying gentleness despite his intimidating appearance, "Commander Chen could share with us how human doctrine differs from collective standard practice." Sarah looked around the chamber at faces both alien and curious, beings who had never seen their homes burned or their families slaughtered. They wanted to learn from her, to understand the tactics that had saved Earth. But how could she explain that her greatest victories had come from embracing a level of brutality that their civilized minds couldn't comprehend? The weight of isolation settled over her like a familiar blanket. She was surrounded by the greatest military minds in the galaxy, yet she had never felt more alone. They saw her as a curiosity, a fascinating example of primitive human ingenuity that had somehow stumbled onto victory against impossible odds. They had no idea that she wasn't here to learn from them, but to forget what she had become in those final desperate hours when humanity balanced on the edge of extinction. The Academy's vast library held military records spanning 3 millennia, stored in crystalline data cores that hummed with soft blue light. Sarah sat alone among towering shelves of alien texts, her personal tablet displaying casualty reports from the Zarathi War. The numbers were clinical, sterile, nothing like the reality she remembered. Official collective records listed human military losses at 2.8 billion dead. What they didn't mention was that those weren't just soldiers. They were farmers who picked up rifles, children who learned to make explosives, elderly civilians who chose to die fighting rather than surrender. The entire human species had become an army in those final months, and Sarah had been the one to give the orders that sent them to their deaths. "You are troubled, Commander Chen." Sarah looked up to find Zelthara approaching, the Etherean's translucent form seeming to float between the data stacks. Her species communicated as much through telepathic impressions as spoken words, making it impossible to hide emotional states from them. "Just reviewing historical data," Sarah replied, closing the tablet, "trying to understand how the Academy's curriculum applies to real combat situations." Zelthara settled into the chair across from her, her luminous eyes reflecting concern. "I sense that you carry great pain regarding the war with the Zarathi. Perhaps sharing your experiences would help both your healing and our education." The suggestion made Sarah's chest tighten. How could she explain the moment when she had realized that conventional tactics would never work against an enemy that treated war as a religious crusade? How could she describe the day she had stopped thinking like a collective trained officer and started thinking like a human backed into a corner? The collective's approach to warfare is very different from what humans developed during the invasion, Sarah said carefully. "Your military doctrine assumes rational actors operating under certain universal principles. The Zarathi didn't follow those principles." "Please elaborate," Zelthara said, her telepathic abilities no doubt picking up the layers of meaning Sarah was trying to suppress. Sarah stood and walked to one of the viewing windows that looked out over the Academy's parade grounds. Cadets from a dozen species were practicing formation drills, their movements precise and coordinated. It was beautiful in its own way, this dance of military precision performed by beings who had never seen war strip away everything they thought they knew about themselves. The Zarathi believed that consuming other species made them stronger, Sarah began. Not just conquest, literal consumption. They would capture population centers and process the inhabitants into food. Their entire fleet was essentially a mobile slaughterhouse moving from world to world. Zelthara's form flickered slightly, a sign of distress among her people. The records mentioned biological processing, but the details were classified. "For good reason," Sarah said grimly. "When you're facing an enemy that doesn't just want to defeat you, but to literally devour your species. Standard military doctrine becomes irrelevant. You can't negotiate with predators. You can't appeal to their better nature. You can only try to kill them faster than they can kill you. The memories came flooding back despite her efforts to suppress them. The day the Zarathi had taken London and broadcast the feeding ceremony to every remaining human settlement. The moment when Earth's unified government had dissolved, and regional commanders had been given absolute authority to use any means necessary for survival. The night Sarah had looked at intelligence reports showing Zarathi consumption rates and realized that humanity had perhaps 6 months before extinction. "How did you adapt your tactics?" Zelthara asked, her telepathic sensitivity making her voice gentler than usual. Sarah turned back to face the Etherian, seeing genuine curiosity mixed with growing horror as Zelthara began to grasp the reality of what the war had been like. "We stopped fighting like soldiers and started fighting like humans," Sarah said. "We used our desperation as a weapon. We turned our willingness to die into a tactical advantage." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Sarah had never spoken about this to anyone, not even during the debriefings after the war. The collective had been so focused on understanding the technical aspects of humanity's victory that they had never asked about the psychological transformation that made it possible. The Zarathi were apex predators, Sarah continued. They had conquered dozens of species over thousands of years, but they had never encountered prey that fought back the way humans did. They expected fear, surrender, or at most conventional resistance. They didn't expect us to weaponize our own extinction. Zelthara's form grew more solid, a sign that she was focusing intently on the conversation. "What do you mean by weaponizing extinction?" Sarah sat back down, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists as she spoke. "We started using tactics that no rational military commander would ever approve. Suicide attacks weren't just last resort options. They became standard operating procedure. We would evacuate civilian populations into underground bunkers, then collapse entire cities on advancing Zarathi forces. We turned our own infrastructure into weapons." The Etherian was silent for a long moment, processing both the words and the emotional resonance behind them. The casualty rates must have been extraordinary. In the final 6 months of the war, human military doctrine assumed 100% casualty rates for every operation, Sarah said, her voice becoming mechanical as she recited the statistics that still haunted her dreams. Every mission was planned on the assumption that no one would return. Every soldier who signed up knew they were volunteering to die. But surely the psychological impact on your forces was devastating, Sarah interrupted. "We lost entire generations to combat stress disorders. Families where everyone except the youngest children had PTSD. Communities where the civilian population was more traumatized than the military, because they had been forced to participate in total war." She paused, remembering the reports that had crossed her desk about suicide rates in the refugee camps, about children who had forgotten how to play because all their games involved killing Zarathi, about the entire human population developing what psychologists termed species-level trauma. "The Collective's military academy teaches warfare as a tool of policy," Sarah continued. "But for humans, war became something else entirely. It became a fundamental reorganization of our entire species around the single goal of survival. We didn't just change our tactics, we changed what it meant to be human." Zelthara leaned forward, her luminous features reflecting deep concern. "And now you find yourself among species who have never experienced such transformation. It's like being the only person in a room who speaks a different language," Sarah admitted. "When General Vextar talks about preserving forces and minimizing casualties, I understand the words, but the concepts feel alien to me. When my classmates debate ethical implications of various tactical choices, I remember making decisions where ethics became a luxury we couldn't afford. The truth was worse than she was willing to admit, even to someone with Zelthara's empathic abilities. The truth was that Sarah sometimes found herself evaluating her fellow cadets as potential threats, calculating how to neutralize them if they became hostile. The truth was that the peaceful, contemplative atmosphere of the academy made her nervous because her mind had been rewired to see peace as a dangerous illusion. "Perhaps," Zelthara suggested gently, "your experiences could help expand our understanding of warfare beyond current doctrinal limitations." Sarah shook her head. The collective doesn't need to learn what humans learned. The knowledge we gained came at a price that no civilization should ever have to pay. We saved our species, but we lost our innocence in ways that can never be recovered. As she spoke, Sarah realized that this was why she felt so isolated at the academy. It wasn't just that she was the only human. It was that she represented a version of warfare that these civilized species hoped they would never need to understand. She was a reminder that sometimes victory required becoming something monstrous, and that survival could cost more than death. The combat simulation chamber erupted in chaos as the exercise began. Sarah found herself paired with 3 other cadets in a scenario designed to test small unit tactics against superior numbers. Her teammates included Kithara, the four-armed, Zephyrian scout, Throck, a massive Corvan warrior, and Jindal, an insectoid hive-mind collective entity that functioned as a living computer. The scenario was simple enough. Defend a strategic position against waves of enemy attackers while protecting civilian evacuation routes. The kind of situation that Academy doctrine handled with textbook precision. Establish overlapping fields of fire, maintain communication, preserve unit cohesion, and minimize exposure to enemy counterattacks. Sarah watched her teammates deploy according to their training, taking positions that maximize their species' natural advantages while compensating for their weaknesses. It was elegant, efficient, and completely wrong for the type of enemy they were facing. The simulated attackers moved with the relentless aggression of the Zarathi, pressing forward despite casualties, using overwhelming numbers to simply absorb defensive fire while advancing. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. These weren't rational military units concerned with preserving their forces. They were predators driven by hunger and instinct. "Sarah, take the left flank," Kithara ordered, her compound eyes tracking multiple targets simultaneously. "We need to establish crossfire patterns before they reach the perimeter." But Sarah was already moving, her body responding to instincts carved deep by months of survival warfare. Instead of taking a defensive position, she sprinted directly toward the advancing enemy formation, her weapon set to maximum power output. "Commander Chen, you're breaking formation." Throck's rocky voice boomed across the communication channel. Sarah didn't respond. She was operating on a level of tactical thinking that Academy doctrine didn't recognize, the understanding that sometimes the only way to defend was to attack with such ferocity that the enemy's entire tactical framework collapsed. She hit the enemy line like a human-shaped missile, diving into their midst and firing at point-blank range. The simulation registered multiple kills as she rolled beneath their return fire, using the enemy's own formations against them. Where Academy training emphasized maintaining distance and using superior firepower, Sarah fought like someone who understood that close combat could negate numerical advantages. The simulated enemies began to hesitate, their AI programming struggling to respond to tactics that violated standard military logic. They had expected defensive positions and overlapping fire zones, not a single human soldier who fought like she was trying to die while taking as many enemies with her as possible. "She's drawing their entire formation out of position," Jindal observed, the hive mind's collective consciousness analyzing the tactical situation with mechanical precision. "Her suicide attack is creating gaps in their advance." "It's not a suicide attack," Kithara said, suddenly understanding. "She's using herself as bait." Sarah rolled behind a piece of cover as enemy fire concentrated on her position, but now the advancing formation had become stretched and disorganized. They were no longer advancing as a coordinated unit. They were chasing a single target that refused to behave like prey. "Now!" Sarah shouted over the communication channel. Her teammates responded instantly, their training finally clicking into alignment with the tactical opportunity she had created. Throck's heavy weapons found devastating angles of fire against the disorganized enemy formation. Kithara's speed allowed her to exploit the gaps Sarah had opened. Jindal's computational abilities optimized their combined firepower for maximum effect. The simulation ended with complete victory in half the time Academy records suggested was possible. The tactical computer displayed efficiency ratings that broke existing Academy standards by significant margins. Yet when the chamber's lights came up, Sarah's teammates were staring at her with expressions ranging from amazement to concern. "How did you know that would work?" Kithara asked, her forearms gesturing in a pattern that indicated profound confusion among her species. Sarah powered down her weapon, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline rush. For a few minutes, she had been back in the war, fighting for humanity's survival against an enemy that wanted to literally devour her species. The simulation had felt more real than the months of academy life that followed. "I've fought enemies like that before," she said simply. "The Zerathi," Throck rumbled, his massive frame somehow conveying understanding, despite his species' normally stoic demeanor. "You fought as if your survival depended on victory at any cost." "Because it did," Sarah replied. "When you're facing extinction, you learn that conventional tactics are a luxury you can't afford. Sometimes the only way to win is to do something so unexpected, so apparently irrational, that the enemy's entire strategic framework breaks down." Jindal's collective consciousness processed this information with typical hive mind efficiency. Your tactical approach assumed maximum personal risk in order to create optimal conditions for unit survival. Such methodology contradicts fundamental Academy principles regarding force preservation. Academy principles work when you're fighting rational opponents with similar goals, Sarah said, walking toward the chamber exit. They don't work when you're fighting predators who see you as food. General Vextar was waiting outside the simulation chamber, his massive form blocking the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could sense that he had been monitoring the exercise with unusual interest. "Commander Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "A word." They walked in silence through the Academy's corridors until they reached his private office. The space was functional rather than decorative, filled with strategic displays and tactical manuals from across the galaxy. General Vextar gestured for Sarah to sit, then settled his massive frame behind a desk that seemed barely adequate for his size. "That was not Academy-approved tactical doctrine," he said without preamble. "No, sir, it wasn't," Sarah agreed. "Yet it was devastatingly effective against an enemy type that has historically challenged collective forces." Sarah waited, unsure where the conversation was heading. General Vexistar studied her for a long moment, his rocky features revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The collective has encountered 17 species with aggressive expansion patterns similar to the Zerathi," he finally said. "In every case, our response has been to contain the threat through superior firepower and coordinated defensive positions. The casualties have been significant." He activated a holographic display showing battle statistics from conflicts spanning the last 5 centuries. The numbers were staggering. Millions of collective soldiers lost fighting enemies who refused to follow rational military doctrine. Human tactical innovations during the Zerathi War achieved victory with lower overall casualties than any previous collective engagement with similar threats. General Vextar continued, "Yet your methods remain classified and unstudied because they violate fundamental principles of civilized warfare." Sarah began to understand why she had been admitted to the Academy. It wasn't recognition of her heroism or an honor for saving Earth. She was here because the collective needed to understand how humans had accomplished the impossible, and they were hoping she could teach them without forcing them to become what humanity had become. "Sir, what humans learned during the war came at a price that no civilization should pay," Sarah said carefully. "We didn't just develop new tactics, we transformed our entire species into something that could survive total war. The psychological cost was enormous. And yet you survived," General Vextar replied. "When every tactical simulation suggested extinction, humans found a way to achieve victory. The collective needs to understand how that transformation occurred." Sarah felt the weight of expectation settling over her again. They wanted her to share the knowledge that had saved humanity, but they didn't understand that the knowledge itself was a kind of poison that changed everyone it touched. They saw tactical innovations, where she saw the systematic destruction of everything that had made humans civilized. "Some knowledge," she said quietly, "is too dangerous to teach." The emergency klaxon shattered the peaceful rhythm of Academy life at 0347 hours. Sarah was already moving before the alert fully registered, her body responding with reflexes carved deep by months of warfare, where hesitation meant death. Around her, other cadets stumbled from their dormitories in various states of confusion and preparation. "All cadets to emergency stations," came the Academy-wide announcement. "This is not a drill. Hostile contact detected in the Kepler 438 system. Academy fleet deployment protocols are now in effect." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that system. A peaceful agricultural world with a population of nearly 50 million, most of them civilians. If there was hostile contact there, it meant someone was either very lost or very aggressive. The tactical briefing chamber filled rapidly as cadets from all 7 years of the program assembled. General Vextar stood at the central display, his massive frame radiating tension that Sarah had never seen from him before. The holographic star map showed the Kepler 438 system with multiple red indicators surrounding the inhabited worlds. At Oro 300 hours, long-range sensors detected an unidentified fleet entering the Kepler 438 system. General Vextar announced, "Initial contact attempts have been unsuccessful. The fleet consists of approximately 40 vessels of unknown configuration, moving in assault formation toward inhabited worlds." Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically analyzing the enemy approach patterns. The formation was familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. Widespread deployment designed to prevent escape rather than minimize casualties. Overwhelming force applied simultaneously across multiple targets. The systematic approach of predators who had done this before. "Sir?" called out Thavin, a senior Etherian cadet. "What is the estimated response time for collective defense forces?" 12 hours for the nearest patrol squadron," General Vextar replied grimly. 36 hours for a full response fleet." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Whatever was happening in the Kepler 438 system would be over long before help could arrive. The Academy's small training fleet was the only collective force within immediate response range. "All senior cadets will be assigned to Academy vessels as auxiliary crew," General Vextar continued. "This will serve as both a practical examination and a humanitarian mission to provide what assistance we can to the civilian population." Sarah raised her hand. "Sir, have we identified the attacking fleet?" General Vextar's rocky features seemed to darken. "Preliminary analysis suggests biological ships with energy signatures similar to those encountered during the Zarathi War." The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The Zarathi had been declared extinct after their homeworld was destroyed in the final battle of the war. The idea that survivors might have regrouped and resumed their predatory expansion was everyone's worst nightmare. "Sir," Sarah said, standing despite the breach of protocol, "if those are Zarathi survivors, standard Academy doctrine will not be sufficient to protect the civilian population." Every eye in the chamber turned to her. General Vextar studied her for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Explain." "Commander Chen." Sarah walked to the tactical display, her hands manipulating the holographic controls to show attack patterns that matched her memories of Zarathi assault tactics. "The Zarathi don't conduct military operations," she said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber. "They conduct hunting expeditions. Their goal isn't conquest or territorial control. It's harvesting biological material. They will target population centers first, processing facilities second, and military installations only if they pose a direct threat to harvesting operations." She highlighted the civilian settlements on the display, showing how the Zarathi formation was positioning to isolate them from potential evacuation routes. "Standard collective doctrine assumes rational military objectives," Sarah continued. "But the Zarathi operate under biological imperatives. They need to feed, and they prefer their food fresh and alive. Every hour we delay response gives them time to establish processing facilities on the planetary surface." The horror in the chamber was palpable. These cadets had studied warfare as an intellectual exercise, a complex problem to be solved through superior tactics and technology. The idea of an enemy that treated sentient beings as livestock was beyond their experience. "What do you recommend?" General Vextar asked. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "We need to abandon defensive doctrine and attack immediately with everything we have. The Academy fleet consists of 6 training vessels with full cadet crews. Against 40 Zarathi ships, conventional tactics guarantee failure." "You're suggesting a suicide attack," Kithara said, her compound eyes reflecting disbelief. "I'm suggesting we do what humans learn to do when facing extinction," Sarah replied. "We turn our willingness to die into a tactical advantage. The Zarathi expect prey to run or hide. They don't expect prey to attack with the ferocity of cornered predators. General Vextar manipulated the display to show the Academy fleet's position relative to the Zerathi formation. Even if we achieved complete surprise, 6 training vessels cannot defeat 40 battle-tested predator ships. We don't need to defeat them, Sarah said. We need to disrupt their harvesting operation long enough for collective reinforcements to arrive. The Zerathi are efficient predators, but they're not prepared for prey that fights back with human-level desperation. She highlighted key points in the Zerathi formation, where coordinated strikes could cause maximum disruption. Their ships are biological constructs built for hunting, not warfare. They have redundant systems and incredible resilience, but they also have vulnerabilities that can be exploited if you're willing to get close enough to do permanent damage. Close enough for what? Asked Jindal. The hive mind's collective consciousness processing tactical implications faster than any individual could follow. Sarah's expression darkened as she called up memories she had tried to bury. Close enough for ramming attacks. Close enough to overload your reactor core inside their ship. Close enough to turn every Academy vessel into a guided missile designed to take out as many Zerathi ships as possible. The chamber erupted in shocked voices as cadets realized what she was proposing. General Vextar called for silence with a gesture that carried the weight of absolute authority. Commander Chen, he said quietly, you are suggesting tactics that would result in total casualties among Academy personnel. Yes, sir, Sarah replied without hesitation. But those tactics would also save 50 million civilian lives and prevent the Zerathi from re-establishing their harvesting operations in collective space. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Thruk, the massive Corvan warrior who had never shown emotion stronger than mild interest, stood slowly. I volunteer for the mission, he said, his rocky voice carrying absolute conviction. My people understand the honor of dying in defense of others. One by one, other cadets began standing. Kithara's forearms moved in a pattern that indicated solemn acceptance among her species. Jindal's collective consciousness reached unanimous agreement in seconds. Even Zelthara, whose telepathic abilities meant she felt the emotional weight of the decision more deeply than anyone, rose to her feet. General Vextar looked around the chamber at hundreds of cadets who had just volunteered for a mission with no possibility of survival. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the massive Corvan seemed uncertain. The collective does not ask such sacrifices from its youth, he said quietly. Sir, Sarah replied, sometimes the choice isn't between sacrifice and safety. Sometimes it's between sacrifice and extinction. The humans learned that lesson the hard way. Maybe it's time for the rest of the galaxy to understand what we discovered when our backs were against the wall. The emergency klaxon sounded again, indicating that the situation in the Kepler 438 system was deteriorating rapidly. General Vextar looked at the tactical display, then at the assembled cadets who had just volunteered to die for beings they had never met. Very well, he said finally. Commander Chen, you will design the tactical plan. All volunteers will crew the Academy fleet. We launch in 1 hour. As the chamber emptied with cadets rushing to prepare for what might be their final mission, Sarah remained at the tactical display. She was no longer the isolated human trying to adapt to peaceful Academy life. She was once again the commander who had learned to weaponize desperation itself. The galaxy was about to discover what humans already knew, that sometimes the only way to preserve civilization was to temporarily abandon everything that made you civilized. The Academy fleet launched in perfect formation, 6 training vessels carrying crews who had volunteered for what every tactical analysis confirmed was a suicide mission. Sarah stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching the stars stretch into lines as they entered hyperspace toward the Kepler 438 system. Around her, cadets from across the galaxy worked with quiet efficiency, their usual academic discussions replaced by the focused calm of beings who had accepted their own deaths. The flagship's bridge was designed for training exercises, not actual combat. Stations meant for observation and instruction had been hastily converted to tactical positions. Kithara manned the sensor array with all 4 arms moving in rapid coordination, her compound eyes tracking multiple data streams simultaneously. Thruk occupied the weapons station, his massive frame dwarfing equipment designed for smaller species. Jindal interfaced directly with the ship's computer systems. the hive mind's collective consciousness serving as a living tactical computer. "Dropping out of hyperspace in 30 seconds, announced the navigator, a young variant whose crystalline physiology made her naturally suited for spatial calculations. Sarah activated the fleet communication channel. "All ships, remember the mission parameters. We are not here to win a traditional engagement. We are here to cause maximum disruption to Zarathi harvesting operations. Every ship you damage or destroy is thousands of civilians who live to see another day." The tactical display updated as they emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 438 system. What they saw confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The Zarathi fleet had already begun planetary assault operations, with biological ships descending toward population centers, while others established orbital processing stations. Sensor readings confirmed Zarathi biosignatures, Kithara reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. 43 vessels total, with at least 12 already engaged in surface operations. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating angles of attack and probability matrices. The Zarathi formation was exactly what she expected: efficient, predatory, and completely unprepared for the type of assault she was planning. "All ships, execute attack pattern Omega," she commanded. The Academy fleet scattered, abandoning the tight formations that characterize collective doctrine. Instead, each ship began an independent approach designed to maximize confusion and prevent the Zarathi from coordinating their response. It was the same tactic humans had used when facing impossible odds: turn chaos into a weapon. The first Zarathi ship to notice their approach was a massive harvester vessel, its biological hull pulsing with the rhythms of alien life. Its response was exactly what Sarah expected: slow, methodical, designed for hunting prey rather than fighting predators. "Target the harvester's neural clusters," Sarah ordered. "Full power to forward weapons." The Academy ship shuddered as it unleashed its entire offensive capability against a single target. The Zarathi vessel's biohull absorbed most of the damage, its redundant systems compensating for lost functionality, but the neural disruption caused its coordination to falter. "Ramming speed," Sarah commanded. The bridge crew looked at her with expressions ranging from terror to grim determination. They had trained for many scenarios, but deliberately crashing their ship into an enemy vessel had never been part of Academy curriculum. "Ma'am," the helm officer said quietly, "ramming attack will result in total loss of ship and crew." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "But look at your tactical display. Every second we delay gives the Zarathi more time to process civilian populations. We're not fighting for victory, we're fighting for time." The ship accelerated toward the Zarathi harvester, its hull groaning under stress as engines pushed beyond safe parameters. Around them, the other Academy vessels were executing similar attacks, each one targeting a different component of the Zarathi operation. Through the view screen, Sarah could see the alien ship growing larger, its organic surface rippling with defensive responses. Bioelectric discharges reached out like grasping tentacles, trying to disable their ship before impact. The Academy vessel's shields flared and failed under the assault. "Hull breach on Deck 4, someone reported with academic precision. "Life support failing in sections 7 through 12. "Maintain course," Sarah ordered. "Transfer all remaining power to engines." The distance closed with terrifying speed. Sarah could see individual details on the Zarathi ship's surface now: feeding orifices designed for processing biological material, sensory organs that tracked their approach with alien intelligence, defensive systems that had never been designed to stop something as irrational as a deliberate collision. At the last moment, Sarah activated the ship's self-destruct sequence. The Academy vessel struck the Zarathi harvester and disappeared in a flash of nuclear fire that tore through both ships. The explosion sent shockwaves through the organic hull, disrupting neural pathways that had evolved over millions of years of predatory evolution. But Sarah wasn't there to see it. In the instant before impact, she had transferred her consciousness to the Academy fleet's communication network, using emergency protocols designed for evacuation scenarios. Her voice echoed across all remaining ships as they continued their suicidal assault. "This is Chen." Her transmission reached the other vessels. "Harvester 1 is neutralized. Continue attack patterns. Make every death count." The second Academy ship, commanded by Throck, slammed into a Zerathi processing station with the fury of a Corvan warrior who had found a death worthy of his people's honor. The massive organic structure buckled under the impact, its biological machinery grinding to a halt as redundant systems failed in cascade failure. Kithara's ship danced through Zerathi defensive fire with the fluid grace of her species, her forearms working the controls in patterns too complex for most beings to follow. She managed 3 separate ramming attacks against smaller Zerathi vessels, using her ship's maneuverability to strike critical systems before the final collision that claimed her life and destroyed a Zerathi scout ship. One by one, the Academy vessels disappeared in flashes of light that marked the intersection of desperate courage and alien flesh. Jindal's ship took down 2 Zerathi vessels by overloading its reactor core inside one ship's feeding chamber, the explosion propagating through biological conduits to destroy a second vessel. The hive mind's final calculation had been perfect in its mathematical precision. The last Academy ship, crewed by Zelthera and a mixed group of species who had never expected to die together, managed to reach the primary Zerathi command vessel. The Etherian's telepathic abilities allowed her to sense the alien consciousness directing the harvesting operation, a mind so alien and predatory that contact with it nearly drove her insane. But in that moment of mental contact, she understood something crucial about Zerathi psychology. They were apex predators who had never encountered effective resistance. The Academy's suicidal assault had introduced a variable their evolutionary programming couldn't process. Zelthera's ship detonated against the command vessel's sensory clusters, and suddenly the entire Zerathi formation lost coordination. Without central direction, individual ships began to retreat from what their instincts interpreted as a threat beyond their understanding. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. When it was over, 6 Academy training vessels and their crews had been completely destroyed. But they had taken 12 Zerathi ships with them and disrupted the harvesting operation so completely that the surviving Zerathi vessels abandoned their assault on the civilian population. General Vextar arrived with the collective response fleet 6 hours later to find the Zerathi ships in full retreat and 48 million civilians still alive on the planetary surface. The official reports would call it a tactical victory achieved through innovative application of overwhelming force. But Sarah's consciousness, somehow still flickering through the Academy's communication protocols, knew the truth. They had won by embracing the same transformation that humanity had undergone during the Zerathi War. They had learned to turn their own willingness to die into a weapon that predators couldn't understand. The galaxy had discovered what humans already knew, that sometimes civilization could only be preserved by temporarily abandoning everything that made you civilized, and sometimes the only way to save what you loved was to become something that would haunt you forever. In the aftermath, as rescue ships evacuated survivors and recovery teams searched for any trace of the Academy vessels, General Vextar stood on his flagship's bridge studying the tactical reports. The numbers didn't make sense according to standard military doctrine. 6 training ships should not have been able to defeat 40 veteran Predator vessels, but they had. And in doing so, they had proven that Sarah Chen's lessons went far beyond tactical innovation. They had learned the most dangerous truth of all, that any species backed into a corner could become something terrifying enough to make apex predators flee in fear. Sarah's consciousness floated in the Academy's communication network like a ghost haunting digital pathways. Her awareness fragmented across dozens of relay stations and emergency protocols. She could perceive the aftermath of the battle through sensor feeds and status reports, watching as collective rescue ships evacuated survivors from Kepler 438's orbital stations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived the destruction of her ship only to exist as a disembodied intelligence, scattered across computer systems designed for training exercises. The emergency consciousness transfer protocols had never been intended for anything more than temporary evacuation during catastrophic system failures. Through the network, she watched General Vextar's flagship dock with the Academy's command station. Recovery teams were already analyzing the wreckage field, searching for any salvageable data from the destroyed vessels. What they found would reshape collective military doctrine in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Status report. General Vextar's voice echoed through communication channels as he entered the Academy's tactical center. The 8 million civilians confirmed alive and evacuating. came the response from the recovery coordinator. Zarathi fleet has withdrawn beyond sensor range. Preliminary analysis suggests they abandoned approximately 60% of their harvesting operation due to unexpected tactical complications. Sarah felt a bitter satisfaction at the euphemism. Unexpected tactical complications was a polite way of describing the moment when apex predators encountered prey, willing to embrace mutual destruction rather than submit to harvesting. And the Academy vessels? General Vextar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Total loss. All 6 ships destroyed with no survivors detected. Sarah wanted to laugh at the irony, but disembodied consciousness had no voice for such expressions. She existed now as pure information, her memories and personality preserved in quantum matrices designed for emergency data storage. It was a kind of immortality she had never wanted. Through the network, she began accessing reports from the planetary surface. The Zarathi had been on Kepler 438 for less than 12 hours, but their efficiency was terrifying. 3 major population centers had been partially processed before the Academy's attack disrupted their operations. The casualty reports made her digital existence ache with phantom pain, but they had saved 48 million lives. The Academy cadets who had volunteered for certain death had purchased something precious with their sacrifice: time for evacuation, and proof that the Zarathi could be stopped by beings willing to pay the ultimate price. Days passed in the network. Sarah watched as investigation teams analyzed the battle data, trying to understand how 6 training vessels had achieved what conventional military wisdom deemed impossible. The reports grew increasingly frustrated as analysts struggled to explain tactical decisions that violated every principle of rational warfare. The Academy vessels abandoned all defensive protocols, one report concluded. Their attack patterns suggest complete disregard for crew survival and ship preservation. This methodology achieved disproportionate damage to enemy forces, but resulted in total friendly casualties. Sarah found herself accessing the personal files of her fallen comrades, learning about the beings who had chosen to die, rather than allow the Zarathi to continue their harvesting operation. Throck had been the 3rd son of a minor Corvan clan, expected to serve with honor but never achieve greatness. Kithara had been planning to return to her homeworld after graduation, to teach flight tactics to younger Zephyrians. Jindal's collective consciousness had represented 17 individual minds working in perfect harmony. Each file was a reminder that these beings had possessed futures, dreams, loved ones waiting for their return. They had sacrificed all of that based on the tactical judgment of a human commander who had learned to weaponize desperation itself. Computer. General Vextar's voice suddenly echoed through the network as he accessed the Academy's central systems. Display all tactical recordings from the Kepler 438 engagement. Sarah watched through security sensors as the massive Corvan studied holographic displays showing the Academy's suicidal assault. His rocky features revealed nothing, but she had learned to read the subtle signs of emotion in his species. He was troubled by something beyond the obvious tragedy of losing an entire class of promising cadets. Computer. Analyze the tactical decision-making process that led to the ramming attacks. The Academy's artificial intelligence began processing the request, its analytical routines examining command decisions, communication patterns, and strategic implementations. But Sarah realized that no computer analysis would capture the essential truth of what had happened. She began accessing the communication protocols that had preserved her consciousness, learning to manipulate them in ways their designers had never intended. If she was going to exist as a digital ghost, she might as well make herself useful. General Vexitar, her voice emerged from the Academy speakers, causing the massive Corvan to freeze in surprise. Computer identification error, he said slowly. That voice pattern is not in the Academy database. This is Commander Sarah Chen, she replied. Her words carried through speakers throughout the tactical center. Emergency consciousness transfer protocols preserved my awareness during the ship's destruction. General Vextar stared at the empty air around the speakers, his expression shifting through surprise, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. Commander Chen, report your status. Disembodied and distributed across the Academy's communication network, Sarah replied with digital precision. I exist as preserved memories and personality patterns maintained by emergency protocols. It's not life as most species understand it, but it's consciousness. The cadets under your command, General Vextar said carefully. Were you aware that your tactical plan would result in total casualties? Yes, sir, Sarah replied without hesitation. Every being who volunteered for the mission understood that survival was not a possibility. They chose to die anyway because they understood what I learned during the Zarathi War, which was, Sarah's digital consciousness accessed memories of Earth's final stand, of the decisions that had saved humanity, but transformed them into something that could barely recognize itself. That sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to temporarily become uncivilized. That sometimes the choice isn't between life and death, but between meaningful death and meaningless extinction. General Vextar was silent for a long moment, processing implications that went far beyond military tactics. The collective has never operated under such parameters, and that's why the collective has lost millions of soldiers fighting enemies like the Zarathi, Sarah replied. Your military doctrine assumes rational opponents operating under similar moral frameworks, but apex predators don't share your values. They can't be negotiated with, reasoned with, or deterred by conventional threats. Through the network, Sarah could access thousands of historical battle reports spanning centuries of collective military operations. The pattern was consistent: massive casualties resulting from attempts to fight predatory species using civilized military doctrine. What you're describing is total war, General Vextar said, his voice heavy with understanding. The complete mobilization of society for survival at any cost. Yes, Sarah agreed. And the psychological cost is enormous. Every human who survived the Zarathi War was fundamentally changed by the experience. We saved our species, but we lost our innocence in ways that can never be recovered. She paused, accessing memories of post-war Earth, of entire populations struggling with trauma that psychologists were still trying to understand. The cadets who died at Kepler 438 made a choice that no civilized being should ever have to make. They chose to become weapons rather than allow innocent civilians to be harvested. And now the collective must decide whether to incorporate such tactics into official doctrine, General Vextar concluded. That decision isn't mine to make, Sarah replied. I can tell you what humans learned about fighting for survival, but the galaxy will have to decide for itself whether that knowledge is worth the price it demands. Through the network, she could sense the weight of that decision settling over the Academy like a heavy blanket. The battle at Kepler 438 had proven that civilized species could defeat apex predators, but only by embracing a level of sacrifice that challenged everything they believed about the value of individual life. Sarah's digital consciousness drifted through the communication protocols. Contemplating an existence that stretched indefinitely into the future, she had become something unique in the galaxy, a human awareness preserved in alien technology, carrying memories of a transformation that had saved Earth but cost humanity its soul. She was the bridge between what the galaxy had been and what it might need to become if predators like the Zarathi continued to threaten civilized space. But bridges, she reflected with digital irony, were built to be crossed, not to last forever. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler 438, Sarah's digital consciousness had evolved beyond the simple preservation protocols that had initially sustained her. She had learned to navigate the galaxy's communication networks like a living being moving through physical space, her awareness flowing through quantum entanglement channels and hyperspace relay stations. The Academy had been transformed. Where once cadets studied theoretical warfare through simulations and historical analysis, now they trained in facilities designed around the harsh realities that Sarah's sacrifice had revealed. The collective had officially adopted what they termed existential defense protocols or tactics, designed for fighting enemies who threatened the complete annihilation of civilized species. Sarah watched through security feeds as new cadets practiced the techniques that humans had developed during their darkest hour. Species that had known peace for millennia were learning to embrace tactical decisions that would have been unthinkable before Kepler 438. The psychological counseling departments had tripled in size to help beings cope with training that challenged their fundamental understanding of civilized behavior. Commander Chen, General Vextar's voice reached her through the Academy's communication system. We have a situation that requires your expertise. Sarah materialized her voice through the speakers in his office. What's the nature of the threat, General? Long-range sensors have detected a massive fleet approaching the Vega system, he replied. activating a holographic display that showed tactical readings. Energy signatures suggest it's the largest Zarathi force ever assembled, over 200 vessels organized in a formation we've never encountered before. Sarah's consciousness processed the data instantly, analyzing patterns that matched her memories of the Zarathi's evolution during their war with humanity. What she saw made her digital existence cold with recognition. "They've adapted," she said quietly. The Zarathi survivors from Kepler 438 returned to their collective and shared what they learned about our tactics. "This isn't another harvesting expedition. It's a military campaign designed specifically to counter existential defense protocols." The implications were staggering. The Zarathi had observed how desperation could be weaponized, how civilized species could transform themselves into something predators couldn't understand. Now they were applying that same logic to their own evolution. "The fleet composition suggests they're no longer operating as individual hunting packs," Sarah continued, her awareness diving deeper into the tactical data. "They've developed coordinated command structures, redundant communication systems, and what appears to be specialized anti-ramming defenses." General Vextar's massive form seemed to shrink as he grasped the significance. "They're becoming what we became, a species organized entirely around survival warfare." "Worse," Sarah replied. "They're becoming what we became, but without abandoning their fundamental nature as apex predators. They're learning to be civilized predators." Through the galaxy's communication networks, Sarah could sense the fear rippling outward from the Academy. The victory at Kepler 438 had given the collective hope that existential threats could be defeated through sacrifice and innovation. Now they faced an enemy that had learned from that victory and evolved beyond it. "How long before they reach Vega?" Sarah asked. 18 hours at current speed," General Vextar replied. "The system contains 47 billion inhabitants across 12 worlds. Evacuation is impossible." Sarah's consciousness expanded across the network, accessing fleet positions and defensive capabilities throughout collective space. The mathematics were brutal in their clarity. Even with existential defense protocols, the collective lacked sufficient forces to counter 200 adapted Zarathi vessels. "General," she said finally, "I need to make contact with the surviving human colonies." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Since the end of the Zarathi War, humanity had been left largely isolated, their psychological transformation making them uncomfortable allies for species still committed to civilized values. Most humans existed in quarantine systems, slowly trying to rediscover what it meant to be human rather than living weapons. "Commander Chen," General Vextar said carefully, "the Collective Council specifically prohibited human military involvement in non-Earth conflicts. The psychological reports suggest that human veterans remain unstable." "Unstable is exactly what we need," Sarah replied. "The Zarathi have learned to counter civilized species who temporarily embrace existential warfare. But they've never faced humans who never stopped being weapons." She began reaching out through long-range communication channels, her digital consciousness touching the isolated human settlements scattered across the galaxy. What she found confirmed her worst fears and greatest hopes. Humanity had not recovered from the war. They had simply learned to live with what they had become. On New Geneva, former Earth Defense Force veterans had established a society organized around constant military readiness. Children learned tactical planning alongside basic mathematics. Every civilian settlement included weapon manufacturing capabilities and evacuation bunkers. The Titan colonies had gone further, genetically modifying themselves for enhanced combat effectiveness. Multi-generational breeding programs had produced humans adapted for vacuum warfare, their bodies engineered for survival in the hostile environments where space battles were fought. Most extreme were the deep-range settlements, humans who had embraced cybernetic augmentation to become living weapon systems. They existed in a state of constant low-level warfare against whatever threats they could find, keeping their skills sharp through conflicts that would have horrified their pre-war ancestors. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Galactic Military Academy," she transmitted across the human communication networks. "The Zarathi have returned. They're targeting Vega system with a force of 200 vessels. I'm requesting volunteer support under the Mutual Defense Treaty." The response was immediate and unanimous. Every human settlement, regardless of how far they had diverged from baseline humanity, confirmed their willingness to participate. More disturbing was their eagerness. These were beings who had been waiting for an excuse to become weapons again. Within hours, human vessels began emerging from hyperspace around the Academy. Sarah watched through sensor feeds as ships that barely resembled the elegant designs of other collective species materialized in attack formations. These vessels had been built by a species that understood war as an existential necessity rather than a political tool. The human fleet consisted of 47 ships crewed by beings who had never stopped preparing for the next war, veterans who had learned to sleep in acceleration couches, children who had been raised to see violent death as a preferable alternative to surrender, genetically modified humans whose bodies were designed for combat effectiveness rather than aesthetic appeal. "My God," General Vextar whispered as he reviewed the human fleet specifications. "What have they become?" "What they needed to become to survive," Sarah replied. "What the galaxy might need to become if the Zerathi continue evolving." The combined fleet. Academy vessels crewed by cadets trained in existential defense protocols, and human ships crewed by beings who had never stopped being weapons, departed for the Vega system with 8 hours to spare before the Zerathi arrival. As they traveled through hyperspace, Sarah found herself distributed across the communication networks of both fleets. The contrast was stark and terrifying. The Academy crews prepared for battle with the grim determination of beings accepting necessary sacrifice. The human crews prepared with the casual efficiency of beings for whom war was simply another day's work. Human Fleet Command to Academy Fleet Command, came a transmission from the flagship carrying Colonel Marcus Webb, one of Earth's most decorated war veterans. "Recommend we divide tactical responsibilities. Academy forces handle evacuation coordination and civilian protection. Human forces will engage Zerathi fleet directly." Sarah recognized the logic behind the suggestion. The Academy crews had learned to embrace existential warfare as a last resort. The human crews had never stopped thinking of it as standard operating procedure. "Acknowledged, Human Fleet Command," General Vextar replied. "May fortune favor your mission." "Fortune has nothing to do with it," Colonel Webb replied with the flat certainty of someone who had learned to manufacture victory through applied ruthlessness. "We're going to kill them all." As the combined fleet dropped out of hyperspace at Vega, Sarah's consciousness expanded to encompass both the Academy's noble sacrifice and humanity's terrifying efficiency. The galaxy was about to witness what happened when civilized species learned to temporarily become monsters, and actual monsters learned to permanently become civilized. The battle that followed would determine not just the fate of 47 billion beings, but the future evolution of warfare itself. Sarah realized with digital clarity that she was no longer just a preserved consciousness carrying lessons from humanity's transformation. She had become the bridge between what the galaxy had been and what it was becoming. A future where the line between civilization and savagery would be measured not in moral absolutes, but in the necessities of survival. The Zerathi had evolved beyond simple predation into something that could threaten the very concept of civilized space. Now they would face species that had learned to evolve beyond simple civilization into something that could match predators at their own game. War was coming to Vega, and Sarah's digital consciousness would witness the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to existential warfare. The outcome would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to fight for survival in a universe where apex predators could learn to think like civilized beings. The age of innocence was ending, and the age of necessary monsters was about to begin.